This video is for students who either have some questions about what historical empathy is or why it is a useful tool to have when studying the past. Some of the resources in this video are taken from day 14 of Unit 3. However, the concept of historical empathy and its role in social studies can be applied to really any content you happen to be studying. Also, there is a graphic organizer that has been made which is called the Historical Empathy Tool, which can be used as a visual guide through this process. And if you are looking for more clarity on how best to use that tool in particular, there is another video dedicated solely to that. So no matter what you are applying historical empathy to, you definitely need an understanding of what it is, but also what it isn't. And as with many things in social studies, the natural starting point for us as students is to read how experts in the field define and explain it. And if we take a look at the first independent work slide in this lesson, which is right here, this is exactly what we have up top. And just as a side note, the slides in this lesson were adapted to accommodate virtual remote learning from the historical empathy tool that I did mention earlier. And I would recommend pausing this video to give yourself the opportunity to read this first paragraph. And when you are done, come back and we'll unpack some of the language and ideas in it. Okay, so now that you've read it once on your own, here are the three things that I'd like to elaborate on. First, the goal of historical empathy, and I'm going to highlight this first section up here. The goal of historical empathy is to enable us to learn about history, the people, the actions they took, and their thoughts and motivations by really taking a close look at how the historical context in which they lived impacted them, the thoughts they may have had, the actions they took, and the degree to which their responses are similar or different to our own experiences in today's world. Second, and I'm going to draw our attention to the note down here at the bottom. After doing all this, you may not only walk away with deeper insight into these historical events and individuals, but also realize ways that the historical record, which we are using to learn about this period, might be limited because of bias, or you may come to realize that the record may be incomplete because other relevant perspectives might be missing altogether. And third, and let me draw your attention to this part of the definition. Being able to empathize with somebody does not mean that you agree with them, nor does it mean you feel bad for them. That's what sympathy is. And believe it or not, sympathy and empathy are not the same thing. When explaining this to my own students, I spend a lot of time reinforcing the idea that empathy is the ability of us to acknowledge the feelings of others. Just to say it again, it is not always sympathy, although sometimes it could be. So for instance, and you can do this along with me, when I explained this to my class, I did an online search for an image of a young person at a surprise party. And the one that we looked at had a young child surrounded by his classmates with a huge smile on his face, but his eyes were big as though he were just startled. And I led my students in a discussion about how we don't know who this young person is, but using the clues, we can build a context of what was going on, and then we can use all of this to identify and acknowledge the emotions he was feeling. Surprise, joy, excitement, and that's what empathy is, being able to identify and acknowledge the feelings in others. Now, if I was to show them another image of a baby who was crying because she misplaced her favorite toy, we could also empathize with her feelings of loss and sadness. Also, since we may feel bad for her, or which is what pity is, we could also sympathize. But remember, empathy is acknowledging the feelings of others, whether positive, negative, or anywhere in between. Sympathy is strictly the emotion of sadness and or pity. Before moving on in this video, I would recommend you do the following. Pause it again and explain in your own words what you understand historical empathy to be, without looking too much at the given definition up here. And I would push you to go a bit farther and hypothesize why it might be an important skill for historians to have when they're trying to learn about the past. And when you are done writing yours, take a minute to compare it to the given one that you see above you, and look for the components that may have been overlooked. Because honestly, being aware of these at this point in the process is going to make your work later on much easier. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is it important that we, as students of history, be able to empathize with people and groups who lived long ago? Not only does developing historical empathy allow us to be aware of the context in which they lived and see things from their perspective, but it also provides us insight into their thoughts and actions, which do allow us to get a fuller understanding of what we are studying. So after going through this process for any given event, you may walk away saying, well, I might not agree with the actions that this person took, but given the time in which they lived, I do see their perspective, which added to my knowledge. Also, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes it does show us the limitations of the historical record or why a source may actually be unreliable. When it comes to applying empathy to historical figures, it is important that we also remind ourselves of the third thing that I mentioned earlier in this video. We are not required to share, agree with, or excuse the thoughts of these people. To expand on this point, I mentioned to my students the case of Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, whose portrait you can see right here. She was a pacifist, meaning she believed war and violence are unjustifiable regardless of the circumstance, and she was the only person in Congress to vote against the United States declaring war on Japan following the attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to the deaths of approximately 2,400 American soldiers, and about 20 ships were damaged or destroyed. First, I asked my students to make a list of emotions or reactions Americans likely had following news of the attack. Then I asked them to do the same thing for Congresswoman Rankin, who devoted her life to nonviolent activism, women's rights, and pacifism. And we ended this exercise by discussing how showing historical empathy does not mean we necessarily agree or share the emotions on either side of this issue, but highlights how we are able to use the context of the event as an entry point to showing empathy for another's perspective, actions, and thoughts, which only deepens our own understanding. So this concludes the video on historical empathy, what it is, what it isn't, and why it is an important skill for historians to have. If you would like a more detailed explanation on how to use the historical empathy tool to help you practice this skill, please see the other video that's dedicated to this.